Welcome to Are You Ready with the Bible Teacher Calls Pillow. What's happening in the world? Let's look at the Bible.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Are You Ready? As you can see, we have a very special guest with us today and this evening. And just before we get started, I want to welcome all of you who may be watching here on Are You Ready on YouTube. Please, if you're watching, if you've never subscribed, please subscribe. Click notification and share this video with as many people as possible. This is a lot of very good information that we are going to hear this evening. So let's drink a little water I got here. Salute to all of you. All right. Today this evening, we are very blessed to have with us Paul Fisher, and he is from the Museum of Arts and Science. And before we get started and asking, we got lots of questions for him. Well, first of all, Mr. Fisher, we're very thankful. Thank you for taking the time to being on Are You Ready? Before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do there at the museum. Please.
Okay, well, I'm the science curator, but really what I do is I run the planetarium.
Right.
So, planetarium was built in 1965, and the idea was it was for local children so they could learn something about the sky. So it's been open since then, and in about 2012 we got an upgrade. Now we have a digital planetarium. Wow. Which is really a nice addition, so you can still look at the stars anywhere you are on Earth. Basically, it's a good sky simulator, but it also lets you fly around out in space, or it gives one that illusion. It gives you really a good illusion of flying around.
Wow.
In the universe, where you can see the solar system, the galaxy, the other galaxies. It's got a lot of real data in it that it displays in what appears to be a three-dimensional way.
Wow!
So it's an education.
You get lots of people go there, correct?
Yes, even through COVID, we still have people coming. Before COVID, we were serving about 100,000 people a year at the Museum of Arts and Sciences in Macon, and things have been tough since then, and I thought they were getting better, but our local school system just went all virtual again. We've had a lot of groups cancel, so things are looking not as much to do when there aren't groups. However, we're getting a software upgrade in the next 2 to 3 weeks, so that'll be keeping me busy, and it'll be kind of exciting to have new software to play with.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing and letting people know who you are. And once again, I'm very grateful that you're here with us on Are You Ready? So here we go. I mean, this is pretty exciting. So to ask about this stuff, and you're the one that would know a lot more than I do. And we're just going to do like I've invited other people here. I like to talk about the basics, right? And one of the first things when we talk about the stars, and people like to know the differences between meteors, asteroids, and comets. And so to start off, if you can tell us what's a meteor and what is it made of, to start off there.
Well, most meteors are made of whatever the solar system was made of.
Okay.
Typically, a meteor is really an atmospheric phenomenon, in the sense that when you're looking in the sky, you see a streak of light, and so that is a meteor. Now, what made that streak of light is a meteorite, and basically a meteorite typically is the rock that you think of that actually gets to the ground after making its fiery passage. When it gets to the ground, it becomes a meteorite. I don't know. You make me wonder. A lot of meteors completely evaporate,
Okay.
and so I don't know what you'd call it during that before while it's glowing, but before it evaporates. I guess I would call that a meteorite as well.
Now, would you say that the meteorite is what people commonly call a shooting star? Is that
Correct.
what you, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely right.
Now, before we go to how, where do they come from? And how often, because people see shooting stars a lot, how often does it happen? Is there a certain time during the year where there's more meteorites than others?
Bunch of questions there.
Yeah.
Where they come from, mostly they are material that is left over from the beginnings of the solar system.
Okay.
In general, it's material that never had the opportunity to coalesce into either the sun or a planet. So it's like leftover material.
Okay.
So a lot of it. There's the question of what's an asteroid. Well, an asteroid, there is the space or in the solar system. Primarily, the solar system kind of has a plane that all the planets orbit in, and that's called the ecliptic. So, as far as you go out, say Neptune, Pluto, most of the objects are orbiting in the ecliptic.
Okay.
And so most of the material in this, there's really material all the way scattered throughout the solar system, but most of it lies or orbits between Mars and Jupiter in what they call the asteroid belt.
Okay.
And so asteroids bump into each other, they make smaller rocks down to dust-sized particles, over the eons. These rocks have kind of ground each other up. And really, the difference between a meteoroid is a meteor that hasn't entered the atmosphere yet.
Okay.
So asteroids and meteoroids, they're kind of the same thing. I really haven't heard an astronomer truly differentiate between them. They're basically they're rock, but asteroids you think of as being bigger.
Correct.
And then you realize we've got this area between Mars and Jupiter that we call the asteroid belt. So we know there's a whole bunch of rock that is still trapped in that region, which generally the excuse for it being there is that Jupiter didn't let that material coalesce into a planet.
Got it. Okay. So that's what keeps that. Now, you mentioned the asteroid belt. Does anybody know how much asteroids or they possibly could be there? Are there thousands, millions of asteroids in the asteroid belt?
There are definitely hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands.
That's a good question. I don't know the exact answer to that, but yeah, there's like hundreds of thousands, and they've got them to. The interesting thing is they, for various reasons, astronomers in the 1800s figured they were going to find a planet there, and it was kind of the right observation for the wrong reason. But they found the asteroids. And so throughout the 1800s, they had, if you sort of think about it, the asteroids to play with, in the sense that they had these little points of light. They knew they could track their orbits, but beyond that, they really couldn't tell much about them. So they learned to use the reflected light from those asteroids to analyze them. So by that, I mean, that's what I say, gave the astronomers something to play with. So they actually learned a lot about what the asteroids are made of. They actually figured out that at various distances from the sun, you find asteroids that you can classify into different families based upon what they're made of, and which is kind of amazing, really. That I tend to, I would think everything's sort of homogeneously mixed
Yeah.
up, but no, it's stratified out there. So, and then some of these asteroids actually don't limit themselves to the asteroid belt. A lot of them dip into the inner solar system. So some of them, and there's like 4 or 5 different families of those. How scientists like to make hierarchies.
Correct.
But there's many different. So they're kind of, they're looked at as being different and interesting because a lot of them do cross the Earth's orbit, or come close.
Yes.
But but generally they're thought of as being as part of the asteroid. If they dip out to the asteroid belt, they're thought of as being part. There are also some asteroids out between Uranus and Neptune, and then as you go farther out in the solar system, you get to the composition changes from rocky and stuff that would be solid at room temperature to ices. So, and when you get out to Pluto, then there's a belt of material they call the Kuiper belt that's made up primarily. There's certainly some dust and rock mixed in, but they tend to be made up more of ammonia, ice, water, a lot of water, an incredible amount of water ice. I'm always surprised when I read about it. And so it gets icier out there, and then as you go even further out, there's actually a sphere of material that surrounds the solar system out, and people argue how far out, maybe out to a light year. Then this sphere of slow-moving icy material is called the Oort cloud.
And that's outside the solar system?
Yeah, that's sort of that's the true outer region of the solar system, right? When you enter the Oort cloud, you're really in the solar system. Okay. Although we think of it as being sort of the planets, but really the Oort cloud is the beginning.
You mentioned, and I know that's controversial, you mentioned Pluto. Now, some people have said that, I heard in the past that Pluto wasn't a planet. Now that you brought that up, you mentioned Pluto. Is Pluto a planet or not a planet?
Well, I was just reading about that. There's a guy who was the true expert about comets. His name was Brian Marsden. And this is a book he wrote. This is a book left over from back in the days when we used books. And it's got every comet ever observed between like 1500 and 1987. So this guy is the guy. Apparently is the American who was behind the demotion of Pluto, which I didn't realize till I was getting ready for your show.
Mm-hmm.
And he died, I think, in the early 2000s. And he felt like Pluto should be a different class of body than a planet. And so he had reason. So I can't remember what year it was. I think it was like 2006 or so. Pluto was demoted.
Right. Something like that.
They gave 5 what they thought the new 4 or 5 criteria for planets should be.
Right.
And so one of the, if you really analyze, I'm of the camp. They slip my mind at the moment, but I'm of the camp that really all of their criteria are actually kind of bogus. And I mean that in a scientific friendly way.
Right.
For example, they said that Pluto isn't a planet because it did not clear its orbit, like say Earth did. There isn't a lot of stuff in Earth's orbit. We've sucked it all. People have pointed out that actually Pluto dips into Neptune's orbit, and so if you use that as a criteria, you would eject Neptune as being a planet.
Right.
And so all of that, all the reasoning can be argued with. But go ahead.
Would you agree that it is then? I mean, as far as you would say, it's still a planet, Pluto.
Well, I guess as an educator, I need to tell people what the scientific consensus is,
Right.
right? Or the science, at least this. Well, what's funny is it's really not the consensus, though. There are a lot of astronomers who disagree. But I will say that the International Astronomical Union, which we traditionally think of as being a valid international organization,
Right.
has declared it a non-planet.
And
But there's still a non-planet, right? A dwarf planet.
a dwarf planet.
Right.
Okay.
However, there are a lot of American astronomers now who are preparing themselves to go back to the IAU and present a case for it being a planet.
Oh, really?
Really.
Oh, so they are going to try to bring it back to being a planet.
Right. We just sent a space probe past Pluto in I think 2015 named New Horizons.
Yeah, I've heard of that. New Horizon. Yes.
Yeah, they have a great their website is really nice, really good pictures. And their program manager, of course, is like Mr. Pluto. His name eludes me because I'm not good with names. But you'll know him when you see him. But he's been there since the flyby. He's been in charge of this program, and he and his colleagues, are making their case. And they have a lot of new data from their space probe to make their case with. Okay. But I always use what I call the Star Trek test on whether or not it should be a planet, which is if you're about to get into the transporter, would you say we're going to transport down to the dwarf planet, or we're going to transport down to the planet?
Right.
So I think if it's spherical and you can walk on it or imagine it, then it's probably ought to be called a planet.
I totally agree with you. I still think of Pluto as a planet.
I do.
All right.
Too.
I think you mentioned asteroid. Can you explain? You may have, if you could do it again. What are asteroids made out of? The reason I say that because I've been seeing some videos, and I think there is. And NASA, and I got my NASA hat on. NASA has sent. I think there's an asteroid called Bennu.
Right.
That they're trying to. They've landed on it, getting some info from it to see what it's made out of. What would you say? You have any idea, basically, what asteroids specifically may be made out of?
Well, Bennu's. There's a bunch of dimensions you can attack that on. Mm-hmm. And let me just put up. So Bennu's we're talking about because, so that the probe you're talking about is named OSIRIS-REx. And so they've actually managed to sample some of the surface. They're going to put it into a re-entry capsule. I think in 2023, it's going to the re-entry capsule is going to be released towards Earth, and it's going to land probably in Nevada, and we're actually going to have some asteroid to look at. And if you look at pictures of Bennu, it's what they call it looks like what they call a rubble pile. So one way to look, a lot of asteroids they think are really just something more like you would call a rubble pile. They are a collection of rocks that have coalesced and are basically just barely. They have a loose gravitational affiliation. And then there's asteroids that are like monolithic pieces of iron. That's the opposite. It's a hard. It's not a rubble pile. So they do. So in a sense, that's one way you can divide asteroids. Is it a coalesced piece of rock, or is it a rubble pile? And the problem with rubble piles is that we imagine that if one of those was coming to Earth, it would be kind of hard to divert because you really can't push on it. Because if you push on it, it's just going to come apart, Whereas, so then there's, there's what is it? The double asteroid rendezvous. Double asteroid. What is it?
Oh, the dart. Is it dart?
DART, yeah. Anyway, I've got it
The
right
dart
here.
mission.
The Double Asteroid Redirection Mission.
That's it.
So they're going to slam basically a spacecraft into this asteroid, and and they're going to see how does the asteroid react.
Okay.
And so I think this particular asteroid, they're not expecting it to be a rubble pile. They're expecting it to be a fairly solid target. So,
Okay.
but anyway, so that's two ways to sort of cut asteroids. If I can give you another dimension, if you'd like.
Please.
Okay, so basically, asteroids they think are the leftover material from the solar nebula. So it's postulated that there was originally a collection of mass that everything has condensed out of today, and it was called the solar nebula. And so about 85% of the rocks that fall on Earth, which we call, which were meteoroids or asteroids at one time, when you cut them open, they have what they call chondrules. And basically, I want a chondrule. Basically, it just means that if you cut them open, they look like a bunch of melted particles in the solar nebula agglomerated and eventually cooled and made a rock. So, and that's that's a very interesting rock because in a sense it goes back to the very beginning of the solar system. Gotcha. And then about 15, so those are called chondrites. If you get at 85% of asteroids, the meteorites are chondrites. The other 15, right, chondrites. So then there are the not chondrites, which they call the achondrites, and they are things like pieces of iron that fall out of the sky. There's a lot of
iron.
I probably should look at this. In the old days, there were three kinds of asteroids. There were stony, iron, and stony iron.
And stony iron. Okay.
So it was sort of like it's either made of rock, stony, or it's made of iron, or it's a mixture of the two. And the thing about them is, if you think about the 15% of asteroids that are not chondrites, it appears that by that I mean if you cut them open, you can't see that they came. You can't see any chondrules. You can't see any agglomerated particles. You cut it open, it's just a piece of iron. They think a lot of that material actually comes from planets that coalesced and what do you call? Well, they were so big that they coalesced, and their gravity allowed the various heaviest elements to go to the center and differentiate. That's the word. They think they came from objects that were so big that through gravity and their heat and the fact that they were melted, that they actually differentiated so that they had an iron core and they had a mantle that was made of iron and silicon and silicates. And then they had a crust with very little iron at all. So it appears that a certain amount of the material, like 15% that falls on Earth, actually was at one time part of a planet. And they call those planets planetesimals because they're assumed to not be full-sized planets. So at the museum, we have two iron meteorites, and they're actually 90% iron, about 9% nickel, and 1% a bunch of other stuff. Like kind of a grab bag.
Okay.
And so the theory with them is they were actually probably at one time part of a planetary core. And then those planets apparently they think bashed into each other, maybe because of Jupiter's gravity, and sort of back up into pieces. Only now they're differentiated. So about 85% of the stuff that falls on Earth was never part of a planet. It's ancient material, and the other 15% was at one time part of some planet-like thing that was then broken up over time.
Wow, that's a lot of great info you just gave. I have a question, continuation from what you meant. We talked about, you mentioned we met Bennu, and then you mentioned Dart. And I think I don't know if it's the Didymus. I think the answer, I think it's Didymus is supposed to, and so my question is, I guess, like a two-prong. If this DART system that they want to do is to hit this Didymus, is it something that you think they're practicing for something? Because you mentioned there's two types. It could be an iron, the asteroid could be iron, or it could be stony, correct?
Right.
Which one of those, let's say, it would be if this system was to work, right? To hit this, and I think the idea was to deviate the asteroid, to move it, and if it's heading this direction, deviate it to go a different direction off our orbit near us. Which would be, I don't know if there's anything the word easier, better for that to be done. What would you say?
Well, I think the distinction would be the asteroids that are rubble piles versus non-rubble piles.
Correct.
So if you've got a non-rubble pile, Didymus has a moon.
Correct.
And I forget the name of the moon, but jokingly they call it Diddy Moon.
I think that's correct.
Okay, so that's good enough for me. So Diddy Moon is about 500 feet in diameter, and it doesn't. I don't think it's a rubble pile. That's just my impression. Although I don't think so. It's going to be a great experiment for deviating a hard object that's coming our way. It clearly, if it can take an impact. One thing we're going to be looking for is can it take an impact?
Correct.
Does the impact just deviate slightly, or does it cause it to completely dissociate and into multitudes of pieces? Because that could make things worse rather than better if one of those was on the way to Earth and you kind of split it up and you made it from one impact to 100,000 impacts.
That's what I would tell. The next question was, because you opened it up for that one, because if it did and it broke up into many pieces, so it would be worse than if it was a rubble pile, correct? It would be the rubble pile.
No, a rubble pile is the kind of thing you'd expect to be easy to blow apart. It's just rubble that's held together by its own gravity, which is pretty weak.
Okay.
So
in the case of the dart, so you would want the iron. If you hit the iron, I'm trying to understand. If you hit the iron, you want that to deviate, not to break up.
Right.
Correct?
Correct.
Okay. So that's what they're trying to do, find out if it does do that, correct?
Right.
All right. Just another question on asteroids. Do you know how fast asteroids can travel? At one time, they can travel very, very fast, imagine. And how because I go to the NASA and I see the time travel and the distance. There are many. They'll say several 3.5 million miles, and then they call that anything under a certain. They call it an NEO, near Earth object. So so how fast do they travel faster? I guess my question would be, meteorite, asteroid, or a comet, we're going to talk about next, which ones would travel faster?
Well, if you're talking speed, it's usually you have to define what you're talking about relative to. So,
Okay.
everything that's in orbit around the sun, the important parameter is how fast it's moving relative to the sun, because that's how it keeps from falling into the sun.
Okay.
And so if you've got objects at Earth's distance from the sun, they're going to be traveling about the same speed relative to the sun. But you can imagine if you have an object going around the sun this way, and you have an object going around the sun this way, when they hit, their relative velocity is very different from the velocity they had relative to the sun. In general, it's going to be higher.
Higher.
So yeah, so I've noticed. Typically, I haven't run these numbers for a while, but I think 30 kilometers a second is a typical velocity relative to the sun, right?
Wow.
I think that's roughly the Earth's. And so then for these asteroids, they're going to be moving roughly that speed around the sun. And when they hit the Earth, though, it can be anywhere from 10 kilometers a second relative velocity to, say, 90 kilometers per second. So 30 is everybody's going 30 kilometers per second relative to the sun. But when they run into each other, it depends if you're going this way or you're catching up with each other. So that relative velocity varies from, say, 10 to 90 kilometers per second.
Wow. I mean, they can come really fast, and the closer they get, correct?
Correct.
All right. Next, I want to talk about comets. Are comets, I guess it may be, I hope that's a dumb question, but are comets bigger than asteroids or smaller?
I would say in general they're not quite. Comets come in a full range of sizes, so it probably would not be fair to say that they're smaller than asteroids. But I will say I think the largest comet that I think you remember Comet Hale-Bopp?
Yeah.
Back in the 90s. Yeah. I think it was like 200 kilometers long. That's just in that range. And so that was considered to be a big comet.
Big comet, right?
Yeah. So they do tend to be smaller. But the problem with comets is they're on really big orbits. They leave, and so they tend to be going pretty fast. They tend to be going faster than asteroids. And the other thing about comets is there are comets that live in the ecliptic. But the kind of weird thing about comets is really they come from all directions. Just like the Oort cloud is a spherical cloud around us. So a lot of comets we think come from the Oort cloud, so they can come from any direction, and maybe it hasn't been here for 10,000 years, so you don't even know it's coming. So, in some ways, if you're worried about Earth being hit by something,
exactly,
they're a greater threat because asteroids maybe you've got time to you can see it, calculate its orbit, project it forward, know it might hit you. You got a few years to work on it, maybe 5, 10, 100. But a comet is just going to appear one day. They usually become visible when they get to within Jupiter's orbit, which is 5 times farther from the sun than Earth is.
Right.
So that's where they typically become visible. And so you've got a year and a half or so. If it's coming for a direct impact on Earth, you really don't only have a year and a half to get ready for it.
Okay, this is very interesting what you just mentioned. So what you're saying is With an asteroid, you have more time to prepare, or like they're doing with the DART, trying to think about trying to deviate an asteroid. But with a
Right.
comet, you don't have that much time to plan to do something, correct? It could
Right.
just be, and you're saying within a year and a half, you got to do something because it's heading
Right.
this direction. Wow. Now, do you know what was the closest comet that has ever come to the Earth?
You know, I have read that, but the specifics elude me. But I think in 1910, Earth actually went through the tail of Halley's comet.
Yeah, I remember Halley's comet, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it was 1910, and I don't know whether that led to any um, uh, meteor showers at that point in time.
Right.
But
Right.
there, yeah. So they're having some comets that, if you look that up, if you Google that, you will find there are some comets that are worthy of note in as
Right.
far as coming fairly close to Earth.
To Earth. So just go this one more time. When you're saying the comets you can prepare, you said it would take about a year and a half. Wow. What I like to do what ifs.
Right.
What if, what if, and I pray it never happens, but what if a comet is, and you have a year and a half, what could they possibly do to deviate a comet coming at that speed? Because imagine it's going pretty fast.
Right. Well, there's just a whole bunch of different problems. Like it typically takes at least 4 years to plan any kind of space program. So it's hard. It's really, in our current situation of technology, it's hard. We've never demonstrated an ability to see a target, build a vehicle to destroy it, and launch it in anything approaching a 2-year schedule.
Okay.
But if you imagine we do have we have a lot of missiles in the ground that
Right.
we used to worry, and we worry about Russia. And
Right.
so if you imagine that we had a missile in the ground, anti-comet missiles in the ground, you could get to it quickly,
Okay.
and you could lay some serious nuclear weapon power on it.
Okay.
And now how you do that without making the problem worse is something that takes a lot of thought and engineering.
Right.
But I guess the general thing you would try to do is you would take that weapon and you would detonate it close to, but not at the comet or within the comet, and you would attempt to heat up the outer material of that comet and use its pressure. It would create pressure as it expanded away from the comet, and you would hopefully use that to exert a thrust or a force on the comet enough to deviate it from hitting you. I would think that would be the a strategy.
Yeah, and I was the reason I'm thinking about, because I think of movies,
Yeah.
Science fiction movies, and I was thinking of the movie Armageddon with Bruce Willis, and I think how you just said it's not that easy as they make it look in the movie. We'll just get within. We only have 30 days, and in 30 days we're going to build this ship, and you're going to go up there, you're going to do this. You only have 30 days, but realistically, you can't. It takes more time to do something like that. Correct?
It does.
It doesn't happen that quickly.
Right.
All right. I want to talk about next NEOs, near Earth objects, and I think we talked about some of them, and how do you know what determines it to be an NEO? How do you become an NEO?
Yeah. Back in the 90s, a lot of governments and scientists realized that there were a lot of asteroids that were coming fairly close to the Earth, and we need to be more aware of them. So really,
Right.
there's been a lot of worldwide work on. First of all, you've got to figure out. You've got to catalog the objects that are coming close to Earth on a regular basis, because they're the ones that are most likely for you to run into. And so you're right. There's a criteria. I think if it comes within 5 lunar orbit distances,
Yes.
roughly, that then it is considered to be a near-Earth object and worthy of tracking, because these objects, their paths are their orbits are constantly changing, little bits, but because of the perturbations from other planets, Jupiter, the Sun, and the fact is, because they're heated by the Sun, as they rotate, they emit radiation that causes basically very small but constant thrust on those objects, and that's called, I think it's called the Yarkovsky effect.
Okay, Yarkovsky.
So they're constantly being perturbed slightly from their perfect Newtonian orbit by the thermal radiation and other planets. So if they come within 5 lunar distances, we're gonna keep an eye on them and see how they're being affected by perturbations, and then I guess there's another class of objects, I forget, that are known to actually cross Earth's orbit, and they there are scales. So astronomers have devised scales to sort of quantify the risk, and I should know more about the scales than I do. But every once in a while, there's a list. I think it's called the Sentry list, SENTRY, and it's maintained by the federal government, the U.S. government.
Okay.
And so objects go on and off the Sentry list fairly regularly, because an object will appear to be on a path that has some finite probability of running into the Earth, and so they put it on that list. So it's got 4% probability, and then that means everybody's going to concentrate on observing that object until they narrow down the error on their trajectory predictions. And what usually happens is they narrow the error and they find out it's not going to hit the Earth, and so then it falls off the Sentry list. So it's a pretty normal thing. You could Google Sentry list and you could go find out. I think right this moment there's nothing on it, but there have been many objects in the past 10 years that
on the Sentry list,
and then were tracked and said, okay, it's not a problem, and it falls off.
Okay.
So there's people actively watching and classifying threats and watching them as they need, with the adding more resources if needed on them.
Right, because I heard a while back that sometimes NASA, these asteroids come by and they may not catch them, or one of them a few months ago, it appeared like they found about it like 3 or 4 days before it was supposed to pass. So sometimes they just appear and they don't. NASA just, could something appear? What I'm heading towards. Could some of these asteroids just appear, or maybe the comet, appear and they don't know about it with very short time? That could happen, correct?
Yeah. Remember, a lot of times the very small bodies tend to be the ones that surprise us, because we haven't seen them because they're so small.
Correct.
One thing that happens is if a body's on the sunward side of Earth, it's really hard to detect.
Okay.
So those are the ones that that can surprise us. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to put together a list of all the possible NEOs that could ever hit the Earth.
Okay.
And so they're trying to. I think Congress charged them with finding at least 95% of them by a
95%.
certain date. Right.
Wow.
So they haven't cataloged them all, and you can only you sort of have to have a lower limit on size because you can't track every dust grain because you can't really even see it.
It'd be impossible.
But you remember back in 2013 there was in Chelyabinsk, Russia. There was it was it was an Earth crosser that they knew about. I take that back. It was an Earth crosser. They sure knew about the family that it was in, and it came from the sunward side, and it wasn't a real big object. So I mean, nobody saw it coming until they saw it in the sky.
Wow.
So that does happen.
And that one that you mentioned, the one in Russia, that when it hit, it caused. Is that the same one with all the buildings, the windows shattered? I mean, it was made a big, like a sonic boom happened when it came in, and it was
a very powerful pressure wave.
But it was very small, right? Small,
like a 50-foot diameter.
Yeah, something like that. It was small compared to other ones, right?
Right.
Wow.
So they hadn't seen it, but when it got here, it made a big bang that was so loud that it I injured a lot of people and broke a lot of windows.
It sure did. Okay. Now you talked about the DART program. Do you know? Because I know that some people have been. One of the things I want to talk about is okay. Do you know anything about? You've ever heard about Apophis?
I have heard of
Apophis. What do you know about Apophis?
Apophis was one of the first asteroids that kind of caused everybody to decide we better start tracking asteroids.
Gotcha.
And so it went on to the Century List and it fell off. I'm not sure they called it the Century List back then, but that's what it did. They saw it, they realized they needed to track it, and I think what they did with Apophis was it wasn't going to hit us for a couple of orbits. So as it went by Earth, there are at least two. We had radar called Goldstone and a radar called in Arecibo in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
And that was actually its purpose was I believe it was built during the Cold War, like in 1965, because they wanted to get extremely good looks at whatever the Russians were orbiting.
Okay.
And so they built this radar, that huge dish that had the ability to resolve fairly small targets as they orbited. Well, they found out it was a really good asteroid radar. So for many, many years, if you see a radar picture of an asteroid, it was probably taken by Arecibo. Okay. And so what always seems to happen is the objects that fall off the Century List, they get a good radar fix on it, because then they not only can get angle, but they can get range and velocity. Okay. And they can measure it directly. So if you can measure range and velocity with exactness, like you can with radar, then you can really calculate its orbit with precision, at least in the near term. And so that was why Apophis fell off the Century List, was they got some really good radar data on it.
Because the reason I bring Apophis out, because I've seen many videos on Apophis on YouTube, many videos on Apophis, and a lot of them are saying people have said Apophis could possibly hit the Earth. But what you're stating that, and I think NASA also said that it's off the list. That there's no, because the date that this is, I'm just going to tell you what I've heard. Okay, the day that people have been mentioning about Apophis was April of 2029. I don't know if you've heard that. And so that if it did hit, it was or if it was going to come close, it was come so close that it might hit, and then of course NASA said, well, there's really no chance of it hitting us during that time. I don't know if you've heard any of that.
Yeah, I think though you're right. I think they've said, quit worrying about Apophis. We've got the data. It's not going to hit us. But there's plenty other things to worry about.
Right.
So, I mean, not specific objects, but we know every day that we're gonna find new objects. We're still at that stage. So, it's funny. I mean, I see things like that on YouTube, and I must. On the one hand, that it's scientifically wrong,
right?
But on the other hand, I think it does illustrate a fear that has some basis in fact, which is the fear is that we're going to get hit by a rock from space, like the poor dinosaurs did, and end up like them. So, in that sense, I think those videos have some validity. The fear is real. The specifics aren't.
At least it does make people think about the possibility, right? Investigate. They can investigate. Right. Okay. Before we finish tonight, because you've given us a lot of great info, I'm honored to have you here. Now, what would you, Paul? Can I say Paul? Paul.
Sure, Paul. Sure.
Well, is there anything you would like to before we finish tonight, to share with the people here on Are You Ready? What would you like them to remember, to think about when we're talking about asteroids, meteors, comets? What would you like to let them remember?
Well, I'm actually been kind of amazed and gratified to see the world has become more aware of this as a threat, and the people are more open to talking about the possibility. I mean, in the 1960s, if you tried to talk about this, people would have said, that hasn't ever happened, or it hasn't happened for thousands of years, and they'd be wrong. They'd actually have been wrong, but that was the perception. So I'm just glad that the people are aware of the threat. And I think there are other threats that are probably more near term, like climate change is sort of us doing it to ourselves. What the asteroid did to the dinosaurs, we're doing to ourselves kind of slowly. Basically it just ruined the atmosphere for those poor guys, and so we're just kind of torturing ourselves much more slowly than they died. But so anyway, I'm just glad that people take that the education level of the world has raised. It really has, and that people are willing to listen and willing to vote for people who will at least put some money into tracking and cataloging all the possible NEOs, even if we aren't building a rocket to go get them, that would probably be an overreaction. But it's great for cataloging.
So, as you said, I think this is the program is letting people know, to be aware, to do their own, investigating and research, and to keep alert. You're right. And in the past, people have said, that it'll never happen. But the more you study, the more you investigate, there's always not a huge, but there could still be a possibility, and that it could happen. So Thank you for sharing all this great information with us, Paul Fisher. We're very glad to have you have been on the program, and hopefully someday you'll be back. Love to have you back and talk some more.
Well, come on down to
Thank you.
Macon, and I'll give you a show.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I'd love to take my wife and son over there and see it. Sounds exciting. Sounds. I haven't been to a planetarium before, and so that'll be something to be able to watch and see.
Well, let me know you're coming, so I'm the one who does the show.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, everybody, thank you for watching us here on Are You Ready? Once again, please subscribe, share this video. This is great, great, great information with everyone. And thank you for joining us tonight. Paul Fisher, thank you once again for being with us. And I hope you have a very blessed evening, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Peace to everybody. Thank you. Have a blessed evening. Thank you. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.